Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and today I'm joined by Scott Coyne from the Belgian Football podcast. How's it going, mate?
I'm good, Rory. How are you? It's nice to be here. Unfortunately, we've not convened to talk about something terribly nice, but it is important.
Yeah, I think I speak for both of us when I say we'd rather not be recording this episode. It's a story that came kind of out of the blue for a lot of people and was a massive shock, it has to be said. Today we're going to be talking about KV Oostende, who recently filed for bankruptcy, and they're pretty much defunct as of this moment in time, unfortunately, and which was the case on mid-May when they decided that they couldn't continue any further. So we're going to discuss that. We're going to talk about the story of how this has happened. Of course, KV Oostende are a massively historic club, a huge club within Belgium, one of the oldest within the country, and for me anyway, it was a huge shock seeing that they'd actually filed for bankruptcy, and I can imagine it was the same for a number of other people. But just before we jump straight into things, Scott, why didn't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm one of the three producers of the Belgian Football Podcast, which is the number one English language podcast covering Belgian football. So we produce a weekly pod which covers all of the latest news, both on and off the pitch, across Belgium, the top two divisions, so the Pro League, the division below that, the Challenger Pro League. And we also like to fit in specials as often as we can, where we get guests from inside clubs coming on to talk to us about various aspects of Belgian football culture. So sometimes that's groundsman, which can be kind of light-hearted and fun, and at other times we get the more serious football business of being a sporting director and the many challenges that presents. So we've got a lot going on. So if you want to keep up to date with what's happening in Belgium in English, then we're definitely the place to come. So I'm one of the three guys who produce that each week. I also do some independent Belgian football consultancy, which arose out of my involvement with the BFP. So sometimes I do a little bit of research and kind of data work for clubs and players, and more often now agents who are looking for information on players to kind of save them a little bit of time, that kind of thing. If you've not checked us out, then it's probably a good idea, because interest in Belgian football's increased hugely since we started working this podcast, which would be almost 4 years ago now.
Yeah, no, I just want to second that. If you haven't listened to the Belgian Football Podcast yet, please do. It's absolutely fantastic. And as Scott said there, as well as your usual kind of league roundups, you've got some really, really in-depth content there surrounding people that you might never normally hear for within football. Anything from the groundsman to high-up officials within clubs. It's really, really fascinating. And it was actually guys at the Belgian Football Podcast that put us on to Robin Beck at KSK Beveren for the episode that we recorded last year as well with them. So do recommend giving them a listen and going to follow the league a bit as well if you can. But today, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about KV Oostende and what is a pretty emotional and sad period for a lot of the fans and anyone really tied to the club. Now, as I said to a lot of people, this seemingly came out of the blue. Is that really the case, Scott? Has this been trundling on in the background for quite some time? I know that things kind of took a bit of a turn when the takeover from Apex Capital had fallen through. I don't know if that was really a surprise or, as I said, if this had been coming for some time.
Well, there's a lot of context around this that I'll give everybody, just in case you're coming at this cold, which I'm sure some people will be. The general situation at Oostende has been pretty bad for a while, but over the last 18 months to 2 years, I think it's kind of got into that serious red flag territory where it very much could have gone the way that it now has gone. I mean, it's quite poignant in many ways that we're actually recording this today on the 3rd of June, because today's the day that the club's administrator, somebody called Werner van Oosterwijk, who's done a brilliant job there in trying to save the club, will formally file for bankruptcy in a court in Oostende. So as of today, legally is the end. It's been the case for probably a couple of weeks now, when it was confirmed that the takeover with Apex Capital, who you mentioned there, had collapsed, that it was going to go this way. There was effectively no time left for any other party to come in and to agree a takeover. And the terms of any takeover were unlikely to change as well. So I suppose the basics that you need to know are, if you go back to 2017, or rather even earlier than that, back to 2013. At that point, KV Oostende were in the Pro League, the top division in Belgian football. And at that time, the club's majority shareholder and owner, somebody called Yves Lahegre, announced that he was going to be leaving the club and selling it. After that, what happens is, and it takes a little while for an acquisition, but you fast forward to 2017, that's the next most significant date. Somebody called Mark Cook, who is now the owner of Anderlecht, a club that everybody will know. Mark Cook buys Oostende in 2017 and starts to invest in the club. Actually, the initial signs are quite good. There's redevelopment of the stadium largely. That ultimately saddles the club with some debt, which has been part of this story as well. Mark Cook wasn't there very long, it has to be said. So in 2017, he announces he's leaving as well in order to buy Anderlecht, as I was saying. We then get to 2020, which is where the story really starts in a way, and that's when the club's acquired by PMG, Pacific Media Group, which is a multi-club network who, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, have a questionable track record. I'll use that word for legal purposes in their multi-club ownership model. They acquire the club and things kind of start to escalate from there. Now, Pacific Media Group have a number of clubs as part of their network, some of whom are minority stake clubs. So you've got Den Bosch in the Netherlands, Taishi in Poland, which is a recent one, Barnsley in England, Esbjerg in Denmark, which their involvement with has recently ended, Nancy in France, Nice in France for a period, and that's probably the high watermark for them. That was a very short but successful spell. They actually sold Nice to Jim Ratcliffe, who Manchester United fans will be acquainting themselves with now, and Thun in Switzerland, which was a minority stake, so they don't have control there, and Kaiserslautern in Germany, where they also have a minority stake, again, not controlling. And Pacific Media Group have, a record of failure, to be really blunt about it, which can't be contested. And there's a number of individuals who've been involved with them over a reasonably long-term period who, again, have questionable track records behind them, which I'm sure we'll talk about in more detail, because a couple of those individuals have really close links in the story with Oostende. But yeah, long story short, really, we've got to a point where the club's reached bankruptcy. Werner van Oosterwijk, the administrator, has been in their post there, effectively having control financially for the last 6 months. His mandate was extended effectively to this week, which was the ultimate endpoint. He felt up to 3 weeks ago that he was very close to agreeing a deal with Apex Capital, as you were saying. Apex Capital are quite interesting themselves. They're headed up by somebody called Mark Campbell, and Apex and Mark Campbell have been trying for a number of years, actually, to develop their own multi-club ownership model with no success whatsoever. So Mark Campbell has been trying to acquire, amongst others, Sunderland fans will be aware of his name. That didn't go very far. He tried to buy Sunderland from Stuart Donald. He also tried to buy Falkirk in Scotland. That didn't go anywhere either. So there was a real doubt as to whether Apex and Mark Campbell would come good anyway. There was question marks about them. Everything was effectively in place for a deal. Van Oosterwijk had managed to reduce a lot of the debt, so he'd managed to really deal with the big problems, the immediate ones. So the unpaid tax, the unpaid social security, those things were all handled. And when it came effectively to signing contracts and transferring money, that's when things fell apart. And Paul Conway, big figure in Pacific Media Group, effectively asked for payment for his shares. And yeah, I'm sure we'll talk more about Paul Conway, because he's a big part in this deal collapsing, and for many people, a huge villain in all of this.
Yeah, as you said, we'll get onto it a bit later, but it's difficult to try and find the words when people are pushing so hard to make a deal happen, and there are these people who just dig their heels in so hard and make it so difficult to the point of asking for immediate repayment, knowing fine well what the consequences are because the club can't pay it. But I mean, for the fans and anyone associated with the club, this is just hell, pretty much. This is the worst possible thing that could have happened. But as you said, this has been going on for quite some time now and has entered kind of alarm bells territory and has been for the last 18 months to 2 years or so. So, I mean, in some ways they'll have hoped for a positive outcome, but unfortunately it's not been the case. I mean, don't get me wrong, KV Oostende they've not been the most successful club by any means, but they've been a staple of Belgian football since day dot, more or less. I mean, they've got matricule number 31, so they're a very, very old club, one of the first in the country. Founded in 1904, so this would have been their 120th anniversary, which makes it even worse. And they've made it to a cup final. They've won a couple of second tiers and not done much else, but they've got a massive fan base and they're a huge club. And don't get me wrong, the fan protests over the last few weeks have been absolutely phenomenal. The amount of mobilisation and support that's come out to try and force a deal or to try and make something happen. And I did actually see, I think it was the post that you put up, that the mayor of Oostende, Bart Tomlijn, has actually been pushing for a merger with KC Blankenberge.
Yeah, that's right. He was non-committal about that. There was actually, this is quite interesting, yesterday there were some extraordinarily emotional scenes actually. Around 1,500 Oostende fans gathered at the Diaz Arena, which is the home of Oostende, to effectively say a kind of formal goodbye, if you like, to the club, because they knew administration was legally going to be filed today. There were a number of former players, both from the recent past, but also the far past there as well. And I actually, in looking at some of the footage that was on social media of that yesterday, and I felt kind of quite emotional myself looking at that. You kind of can't not, to be honest. Yeah, just really extraordinary scenes there. And I think, and this kind of comes back to the context as well, Belgian football has a particular history of having lost clubs, arguably more than any other country, certainly in Europe. The record of lost clubs there is it's unacceptable, I think. It's not unusual for there to be a kind of perpetual financial crisis of different kinds in all sorts of clubs in Belgium, including the big ones. I mean, Standard Liège have got significant issues of their own at the moment. So it's not just, slightly smaller clubs, but there's also a merger culture in Belgium because of that long-term problem as well. I mean, in the last 4 years alone, just to put this in context for everybody, Oostende are the fourth club over the last few years that have been lost. So, you've got Lokeren in 2020 who go bankrupt. Lokeren actually are interesting because they're now on the way back. When they announced their bankruptcy in 2020, they announced at exactly the same time that there would be a merger and that they were going to start again. And they merged with KSV Temps and are now known as Lokeren Temps, and actually they won promotion to the Challenger Pro League at the end of this current season. So they'll be playing in the second top tier. So they've returned to a decent level. But we've also lost Rosselaar. That was also in 2020. No comeback for them. They've completely disappeared. And the individual responsible for killing Rosselaar now owns Reading in England. Reading fans will know all about that.
Die Younger, we spoke with Caroline Parker from the Sell Before We Die campaign a few months ago, and yeah, that's another really well publicised and another individual whose track record of owning football clubs and killing them basically is awful.
Yeah, that's right. And the other one worthy of mention in recent times is Mouscron, who is kind of it's a wonder that Mouscron didn't disappear before they did, to be honest. They were effectively bankrupt for a number of years before the end, and things managed to limp on far beyond the point where they should have. So we've lost them, and now that we've lost Oostende. But if you look at the bigger picture as well, in Belgium, there are currently 6 former national champions who between them have 26 Pro League titles who now no longer exist in their original form. So, Phoenix rising from the ash are not unusual in Belgium. But for me, the issue is, how do we stop this happening again? And just a couple of days ago, the Pro League announced that along with the vote they're going to be taking this week at their general meeting of clubs on league restructuring, they're going to be voting on whether to bring in new measures, new ownership and due diligence measures, and also whether they're going to tighten the Belgian FA's licensing conditions. So for those who don't know, in Belgium, there's a licensing scheme which is operated by the Belgian FA, which is historic and in lots of ways quite unique. And as part of that, clubs have to submit their accounts effectively and be able to prove that they are solvent. That's the bottom line with it. And if you can't do that, there are supposedly a series of punishments that are open to the FA. The reality is that system has been far too relaxed for too long, and now is a point where absolutely that can and should be tightened up, and they are talking about that now in order to try and prevent something like this happening ever again. I mean, obviously it's too late for Oostende, but something like this should have happened a long, long time ago. And on Oostende specifically, there's been a football club in Oostende as a city, as you were saying, for over 100 years. KVO, as we know them, actually themselves, speaking of merger culture, KVO was born out of a merger. So there were two earlier clubs in Oostende. You've got VG Oostende and AS Oostende, who merge in 1981 to become the club that becomes KVO. So the club that we're talking about is quite a young club. It's only sort of 43 years old now, but there has been a football presence in the city for over 100 years. And the worrying thing now is, I mean, the mayor's hopeful that in the future there can possibly be a merger with Blankenberg. But if that doesn't happen, the reality is Oostende will have no senior footballing representation at all, which is kind of extraordinary. So hopefully something can come of that. The one really bit of positive news in this, if there is any, is that they have managed to preserve the youth facilities. So the youth team will still function to some extent at some level, which gives a little bit of hope, I suppose, for growth as far as a merger is concerned in the future. But there's no active ongoing discussions about that merger. It's just something that I think there are some positive signals about. So the future is very uncertain in that sense, and we don't know where we're going to go yet. It'll be interesting to get the thoughts of some individuals that I've been speaking to recently from inside the club, and those very heavily involved on the fan base in the ground. And we're going to be doing a special recording on that in a few weeks' time.
We look forward to that recording as well. It's always good to hear from the people who are actively involved in the fan movements and within the club, because of course they're the ones closest to it, and you get the best representation of the story. But just to go back to something that you mentioned there, of course we've covered so many clubs and nations now which have merger cultures for completely different reasons. And in some ways, and it is in the case of Belgium, that the merger culture is a result of the financial instability and the issues that keep arising, but the merger culture just perpetuates that and makes it worse, because at the end of the day, if you're having to merge with other clubs in order to keep your club alive, then that's just erasing another club and erasing their fan base and their identity, and again, it just makes the issue worse and worse. So, you know, it's one of these things where if KVO do end up merging with Blankenberg, how is that going to look? Are they going to continue being KVO? Are they going to be KVO Blankenberg? What's it going to be? Or is it just going to be the case that one club is effectively just going to be replaced with another to keep them afloat? So, you know, it's trying to find this balancing act between it, and you'd hope that with the vote this week, things are put in place to stop this from happening, because as you mentioned, it happens all too often in Belgium, which, you know, is one of Europe's biggest leagues. It's one of Europe's strongest leagues, and it is quite shocking that it continues to happen and that it's continued to be allowed to happen.
Yeah, I mean, the Belgian league at the moment is the 8th strongest league in terms of the rankings, the way it works. And it's a league that, as I was saying at the beginning, is getting more and more attention all of the time. And one of the reasons for this is it is one of the best places to develop talent. Most of the academies in Belgium are excellent, and young players get a chance in Belgium because of Belgium's place in the kind of footballing ecosystem, if you like, in Europe. It's a great place to get a lot of game time as a young player, develop, and then if you produce the goods, you will get an opportunity to move to a bigger club in a bigger league. So because of that, a lot of the clubs, whether they're larger clubs, whether it's Anderlecht or Club Brugge, Standard Liège, bigger clubs, Genk are in this as well. They have an outstanding academy too that produces a lot of good young players very early as well. They understand that their operating model is one in which they have to bring through a continual conveyor belt of talent, most of which will be sold on for a big fee, which is purposefully reinvested into the club to continue that process, because they know that unless there's a seismic change in world footballing finances, which is unlikely to happen in Belgium's favour for reasons out with their control largely, then they have to be as self-sufficient as possible and to continue to produce the talent that elite clubs want to pay big money for themselves. And that's not only the best way to look at this, I think it's the only way to look at it. Most Belgian clubs, I mean, Anderlecht being the biggest club historically, and for a long time they're obviously the most wealthy, they're not in a position anymore to go and spend big money on bringing in quality players. football finances has changed so much, even in the last 5 to 10 years, that's just not possible for a club like that anymore. So they have to have the same operating model as medium to small size clubs in Belgium in order to ensure that they're financially sustainable and healthy, but that they have a future as well. So there are a lot of things in Belgium that are right, but there are things that are still very wrong. And that's one of the things that we've kind of convened to talk about here. And the death of Oostende is a symptom of that. And now is a point, as I was saying, where the due diligence tests have to get serious. I mean, effectively in Belgium, there was no real investigation of individuals involved in networks before acquiring clubs. And that's an accusation in lots of countries, of course. And the licensing committee that I was talking about, which is partially in existence to prevent things like this, has been pretty lame for a long time. I mean, just take this season alone. I mean, Standard Liège, who've had their own serious financial issues for what feels like forever now, they're reaching another stage again now with a degree of chaos. We don't know what's going to happen there in terms of new owners. But at the beginning of the season that's just finished, the licensing committee's auditor recommended that Standard Liège be refused a licence. The committee went ahead, ignored that advice and gave them a licence, probably because it was Standard Liège and they're a big name, they're a big club. And yet throughout the season, they were penalised on more than one occasion by the licensing committee for not meeting those checks throughout the season. Clubs have to submit regular checks if they're on a watch list, which if they don't meet, they can be punished for. And Standard Liège were punished on a number of occasions for that this season. So all of that has to be tightened up, so that clubs have to get more serious about how they engage with that process. I mean, you have a situation in the division below the top one, which is called the Challenger Pro League. There's a club there called Patro-Uisteden, who, when it came to submitting their licence for next season, at the first submission of this, they effectively submitted a blank portfolio. Now, in my view, you can't have a situation where a club has that much contempt for the process and then goes, don't worry about it, it's not really a problem, we'll submit some paperwork at a second passing in a couple of weeks. There has to be a consequence of doing that. And if you don't meet your second deadline, there has to be another consequence for that, because owners just have contempt for a process and for fans. And that's when, you get away with things that you shouldn't be getting away with. And you have to have a closer look at how these multi-club ownership models work. What are these people doing? Why are they doing it? And what are their intentions for a club? And Oostende have fallen foul for this. I'm sure we'll talk about how Pacific Media Group looked at that as a club and how that had an impact on other clubs in their network, because that kind of explains what's really happened here financially as well.
I think that's a really good point. Before we move on to that, just to come back to what you mentioned about the system that's in place and the contempt for it, it seems all a bit nonchalant, and I completely agree with you that you can't have this system in place where clubs and club owners are basically taking the piss with the FA when they're doing things like that. But, as you say, we don't really have these checks in a lot of football associations around the world, and that's a huge criticism at the moment for many of them. England probably the most well publicised, but it's almost a bit contradictory to not have these checks in place, but then for the clubs to come under so much scrutiny. It needs to be such a thorough process from the beginning right through to the end, because at the end of the day, not having the initial checkpoint in place, if you like, is what allows these ownership groups to end up becoming a bit of a pox on the game. Probably a good example, look at Troyes, who are part of the City Football Group, who have spent X amount of money on all of these players over the last few years, who've never played a game for them because they've immediately been loaned out to other members of the City Football Group, and it's all somehow above board. And obviously they're now relegated into the French national leagues, which we saw the fan protest of that about a month or so ago were absolutely incredible. And I think it's not too dissimilar from what's happened here to Oostende, but as you said, how the ownership look at the club within their wider model is how they will effectively run the club and choose whether or not they want them to be successful or continue.
Yeah, it's really interesting this when you start to look at the mechanics of what's actually happened. And I think I will probably be pilloried for saying this by listeners, but multi-club ownership is a dirty word for most football fans, regardless of who your team is. And I completely understand that, because actually it doesn't have generally a good track record. It doesn't. Having said that, my personal feeling about it is that it's not all bad. And I say that just because I think you have to accept that we can't really get away from this. What we can do is put the right checks and balance in place and tighten up everything that doesn't exist. That absolutely has to happen to prevent things like this happening again. But it doesn't get away from that kind of fundamental shift and change in just football as a business and the economics of it. It's not a business for fans, of course. They don't look at it like that. And I understand that as a fan myself. But at the same time, we also can't bury our head in the sand about it. So we have to accept this isn't going to go away. But what we can do is make sure, or try and ensure as much as possible, that the individuals acquiring clubs have the best interests of that club at heart. And the interests of the clubs part of that network at heart, and that clubs are not seen as merely a cog as part of a bigger picture that is entirely disposable, which is really what's happened to Oostende here. I mean, just to bring this back to Pacific Media Group, their kind of business model, if you like, is essentially short-term profitability through player sales and trading, rather than effectively building a solid infrastructure and a secure financial base for the club and, by definition, that wider network. So they play very fast and loose with the pieces in there. So you have a club like Oostende, which within that network is certainly one of the smaller ones in financial terms and in size terms. But where Oostende make money, that money is effectively siphoned off to service bigger clubs within that network. So the best example here probably is Nancy in France, who are bigger, obviously, than Oostende. You have a situation going back a couple of seasons now. Oostende had a brilliant year under a coach called Alexander Blesson, who is now at Union Saint-Gilloise, who missed out on the Belgian title by 1 point. He had an extraordinary season during that year that he was at Oostende and got his big move to Italy as a result of that brilliant season. They narrowly missed out on a playoff one place at the end of that season, which is the championship playoff. A lot of the players that played under Alexander Blesson there, his key players, who were eventually sold for a reasonable profit, that money was not reinvested back into the club, which it should have been. A lot of that went elsewhere in the network to service some of the bigger clubs' debts, thereby racking up debts at Oostende. You then have a situation where day-to-day bills stop being paid. So, hotel bills, travel bills, rudimentary everyday things, that are weekly for most clubs, stop over a long period of time. So you get to a situation where very, very quickly significant debt has been racked up that cannot be paid back. And in fact, it's deliberate. They know they're not going to be paying it back. And as if that wasn't enough, you have a situation in 2021-22, Oostende paid in the region of £5 million, which is a big fee for a club of that size. I mean, it's big for a big club in Belgium. That's a really big fee for a Belgian club. They paid £5 million for a striker called Michael Byron, who at that time was at Nancy, another club in the same network. And what happened was he signs a contract at Oostende and is immediately loaned back to Nancy, never plays for Oostende. Now, he's a decent player who has a decent track record, and Oostende fans were quite excited about this at the time because he was kind of what they needed. There was a feeling, okay, we're tooling up a little bit here and maybe doing what we should be doing. But he was loaned back to the club that he was already at, and he actually eventually left Oostende, who were his parent club, and goes to a club called Molenbeek, who were relegated from the top flight at the end of this current season. And what's interesting here about that is there's a direct link here in all of this, because the sporting director at Molenbeek, who brought Michael Byron from Oostende as the parent club to Molenbeek, was somebody called Gauthier Ganay. And Gauthier Ganay is a close associate of Paul Conway's, and Gauthier Ganay was Paul Conway's go-to sporting director for a while. So Gauthier Ganay was sporting director at Oostende and was responsible for a lot of these deals that saw the money flow away from Oostende to other clubs in the network. The main beneficiary being Nancy, who was the sporting director at Nancy, Gauthier Ganay. Now, how somebody can be sporting director at two clubs at the same time is anyone's guess. We know it can't be done. It's not unusual for a sporting director to have an involvement at more than one club. There's not a problem there, but to effectively be the full-time sporting director for two clubs like that in the same network is of course impossible. And Gotteg and I, as a sporting director, has presided over, and he can't hide from this, multiple relegations. Nancy suffer consecutive relegations. Barnsley, who he had an involvement with as well on an on-off basis, relegated during his period. Oostende were relegated on his watch as well. And eventually Ganai leaves. So at the end of this current season, Oostende, who we know have now died, have found themselves playing in the Challenger Pro League. So at the end of the previous season, at the end of that great season under Alexander Blesson, he leaves. A series of new coaches obviously come through the door. The players, the quality players that, had them on the up are not replaced. The money's disappearing in other directions. They start to plummet down the leagues, find themselves relegated. Gotteg and I leaves to go to another multi-club network under John Texter at Molenbeek, who are relegated. There's a trail of relegation on Gotteg and I's watch, and Paul Conway's by default, of course, here. So if you follow the individuals with some really simple research, you don't have to do a lot of digging. You can see the same names crop up and the same record of failure crops up. So what they present as a model where they say, what we're trying to do here is use data to identify young talent early that has great sell-on value, which can be reinvested in the network. That's a good model, but they're not doing it. Other people are doing it and prove that it can and does work. I mean, to be fair to the City Football Group, speaking of multi-club networks, they've been doing that for a long time and having reasonable success at it, but they're huge. So I think one of the key points here for me is that multi-club ownership can work, but it can only work firstly if you have really good individuals in key positions in those networks, so good sporting directors who know what they're doing, and you have a strategy that you're actually implementing and that you know that works because you're following the data. And they haven't done this. And the reason they haven't done it is for financial gain on all sorts of levels, and gain that the system in a legal and a financial sense allows them to do this. It's as simple as that. So we have to find ways of preventing individuals like this acquiring clubs. The big question is, should some of these individuals now be banned from football club ownership? That's a big question that a lot of people have to get involved in answering. But there's a trail of failure here and a trail effectively of, mismanagement. Should they now go on a blacklist effectively? The footballing authorities have to get serious about this, but there's bigger problems. There are authorities above these individuals at UEFA and FIFA who there are question marks about as well. So this can only change with fan pressure. And I feel like in Belgium, things have to change there now, which I'm hopeful that they can. But the laxness of the licensing conditions has allowed this to happen in Belgium. Belgium's an extraordinary footballing culture because it's a bit of a trailblazer in a sense. Obviously, Bosman changed the footballing landscape, and it came out of Belgium by accident. That wasn't a deliberate change. Some of that was to do with legal circumstances, but Belgium is very much a country in which can lead on these things, and I would like to think it could maybe do that now.
I totally agree with you. If these things are happening consistently, then now is the time for change, and now is the time to take that step forward and making it happen. As you said, you need to be a trailblazer, and there needs to be at least one division or association in the world that's willing to do it first. Quite like what you said, that if you follow the people and you follow the trail, then you see these patterns emerging. And as football fans, we're not stupid. We know exactly what's going on. Football is ultimately an incredibly corrupt business, and we can't shy away from that, but it doesn't need to be. And I think that's the point of all of this, is that just because this is what it's become, it doesn't mean we can't turn it around, but it has to come from the fans, and there has to be buy-in from the football associations as well. When you mentioned 2021, it was quite interesting. I doubt this is related, but then you mentioned the Pacific Media Group quite like to turn a quick profit. I remember Jack Hendry went over to KV Oostende, sold by Celtic for 1 million, I think it was, then immediately sold a couple of months later to Club Brugge for €4.5 million. So, now, as I said, I doubt it's linked in any way, but at the time, I did find that a little bit strange that was quite a quick turnaround for a transfer. Are the Pacific Media Group known for things like that, or did that flag up as something particularly dodgy to you at the time?
I think both. In all honesty, I think that flipping of players was expected. I mean, Alexander Blesson, who I mentioned, I think he was effectively lied to by the ownership at Oostende. That amazing season he had, I think there's a possibility that if he had been assured, which he was looking for, that some of those key players, and Jack Hendry was one of them, would have been staying a little bit longer, then the likelihood of him staying would have increased. And I think what happened was, I mean, he said this recently over the last couple of weeks, he was told that the money would be reinvested and some of those players would not be sold. What in fact was happening behind the scenes was the exact opposite, and that then made his decision to leave off the back of an extraordinary season, extraordinarily successful season. They were one of the best sides to watch in Belgium that year. To leave and take advantage of his own great season there and go to Italy, which didn't work out for him. You know, he's obviously since come back to Belgium and is on the up again big time. You know, I think it became obvious that there was two things going on. People were being told one thing, while the reality behind the scenes was quite different. And it's infuriating that a club that on the pitch, I mean, that particular season was so good that you thought, okay, there's question marks behind the scenes, but you know, the footballing operations were working on the pitch. You know, the Gauthier Ganais of this world and the Paul Conways are looking at that and going, okay, this can help us flip some of these players. You know, we can make some profit from these players to reinvest within the wider network. There's no commitment or interest in reinvesting that back into Oostende and building them. And there's a question as well about, you know, when you think about multi-club ownership models, how many clubs is too many? Because if you expect clubs to do things for each other's mutual benefit, that's the point of them. I mean, City Football Group are the best example. And bringing it back to Belgium and them specifically for a second, there's a club in the Challenger Pro League, the same division that Oostende were in this past season, called Lommel. They were almost promoted this season. They're owned by the City Football Group, and they've benefited a lot from loans from other clubs in the City Football Group, and that's worked well for them. They were almost promoted because of it. So it can work for you if the individuals in these key sporting director positions are loaning the right players at the right point for the right length of time in order to benefit clubs, and a degree of the money from sales from those clubs goes back into those same clubs. You're always going to have a problem if one club is a trouser for another club in the network. And that's most football fans' great fear about this. And I understand that, because the truth is that happens a lot. And it's what's happened to Oostende. They took particular advantage, the owners, of that fantastic season and flipped all of the profits. I mean, there was others as well. I mean, there's Arthur Tia as well, who's now at Rennes, who probably is going to get an even bigger move this summer. There's a good chance that if he has a decent to good Euros, he'll get another move. There's a lot of Italian interest in him, has been for quite some time anyway. They made a decent profit on him as well. And there's another player who's at Oostende at the same time, who's a big part of Blessing's squad then, called Makhdar Gueye. And Makhdar Gueye went the Molenbeek way of things, along with Michael Byron, and the key figure in that move was Gauthier Ganais again. Now, often, you know, the players are rarely at fault here. They're simply going where the right move is for them at a certain point. The individual's reasons who engineer the move, their motives obviously are very different and are rightly questionable at times. So yeah, if you do the research and you follow the names, you absolutely see the links here. It's not difficult to join those dots at all. And the big question is, you know, what do we do about it?
Absolutely. And I think it's quite clear to see as well with these multi-club ownership models, probably this season more than any, it's now coming out that there is always one club that pretty much has to be the sacrificial lamb in all things. The players get flipped, the money gets distributed elsewhere within the multi-club network, and then that club is just left to rot, unfortunately. And I think, as you said, that is the danger. I don't disagree with you. I think multi-club models can work and they can be effective, but there needs to be these things in place that effectively make sure that they're sustainable so that the clubs within them aren't suffering and that they can actually continue to operate in a way that's beneficial for all the football clubs, so that they're not just buying clubs here and there and then one of them gets taken down so the others can stay afloat, etc., etc. Otherwise it will just keep, you know, kind of continuing on like that. And it's just a shame that it's been allowed to happen. I mean, when it was officially announced that Pacific Media Group were going to take over KVO, were alarm bells ringing then? Did the people expect it to go this way, or were they maybe not so much apprehensive but a little bit more positive for what was to come?
Well, I think there was never a great relationship between Pacific Media Group and the fan base at Oostende, in truth, from day one. There was a lot of promises made, as there always are. But I think the first real sign, for me anyway, and I think people on the inside might feel slightly differently, but for me, in thinking about this, I think the first alarm bell is there was no real effort right at the beginning on Pacific Media Group's part to communicate with fans properly and to develop a genuine relationship there. Sometimes in these situations you have to go, okay, this has not started well, but let's see what we can do. But as time went on, it never happened, which tells you there was never any intention of that either. And that's when, you start to do digging yourself, when you see that other things behind the scenes aren't right. What's different at Lommel, who I mentioned a little while ago, is that the chief executive there, somebody called Mike Green, used to be the chief executive of City Football Group's charity foundation in Manchester City. And Mike, when he came into Lommel, when the City Football Group bought Lommel, they invested a lot of time in trying to communicate with the fan base there, and still do. So they've tried quite hard at a genuine grassroots community level to bring fans back on board who were very, very sceptical because of what had happened to them as a club, and to develop that relationship. And that takes a lot of time and effort. And that's a talent question for me, if I'm honest. It's certainly a strategic one from the club ownership, the ownership model's point of view. But you have to have the right individual who understands that that is a key part of where you're going, if your intentions are good and things are going to work there. And that was never the case here. And I think that has meant that the fans were never really fully on board Pacific Media Group, and why the anger, when it got to the stage that it did, was intense as it was. So that's always something for fans to look out for in these situations. What is the communication like from the ownership group? Is there any indication that they're serious at all at any level, even if it starts badly, which it does sometimes and can be repaired? But yeah, they're key things to look for, because that gives you a clear sign of intent as well. And how often you see individuals' day-to-day engagement with a club. A lot of the people connected with Oostende, you wouldn't see at Oostende games a lot. And when it starts to become publicly known that there are real issues that people are aware of and questions are being asked, then these individuals disappear completely from public view on clubs. So you have sporting directors at clubs who stop attending fixtures, don't give interviews anymore, deny access to things, use their position and the lack of accountability and transparency to hide from further scrutiny as well. So there are some really simple things that fans can do here to work out quickly whether you can save something and whether something is genuine or not. And you're right, Rory, I completely agree with you. It's only the fans that can make any difference here at all. The footballing authorities are not going to do it unless fans continue to pressure for change on various levels. And as I was saying, I think Belgium has an opportunity now to be a front runner, if you like, for what could be done with due diligence. Looking next door to the Netherlands, there was a situation there not too long ago, and there's a Belgian connection here again. There's a company called the Common Group, another multi-club ownership model, a smaller one that's run by another American individual called Coley Parry. They own a club in Belgium called Patro-Uisden, who I mentioned earlier. They had big licensing issues up until a few weeks ago, where they showed complete disregard for the process, and then, turned up with some appropriate paperwork very, very late on after deadlines, and they waved it through, which is just not acceptable. But he tried not too long ago to buy a club in the Eredivisie, and the Dutch FA threw it out. They wouldn't allow it when they were doing their checks, because when they followed the money, they weren't satisfied that he had the funds and was being transparent about, first of all, where the money was coming from and how much of it there was. So effectively, he couldn't prove that he'd be able to service the budget that he'd submitted as part of the acquisition of the club. So it didn't go through, and things like that need to start happening here. The irony of all of this is, if it gets tighter in the way that we would like, in the short term, I think more clubs will be lost. So what can't happen, in my view, is you can't tighten things up and then be lenient to clubs who are definitely going to fall foul of tightening up regulations. So in the short term, there's the real potential for things actually to get worse, which sounds ludicrous, and I think it is, but for this to work, that's probably going to happen as well, which is an unfortunate side effect of all of this.
Yeah, and I think that's probably what's sticking out in my mind, is that you can only hope that something positive is going to come from this, not just within Belgium, but within FAs across Europe as well. I mean, don't get me wrong, not naive to the fact that it will take a very, very long time, but I mean, there is just so many questions around multi-club ownership at the moment. I mean, take Hibs, for instance. Hibs in Scotland, earlier this year, Bill Foley, the owner of Bournemouth, acquired a 25% minority stake, a significant minority stake in there for £6 million, which to me isn't a huge amount of money. And I know that there's kind of been rumblings of financial worries at Hibs for a while now, so maybe that is quite a lot of money for them, but no one's entirely sure how that ownership model from Bill Foley is going to look with Hibs, because it's a minority stake, and he says, well, we'll send some players your way and you can send us some players our way, and it's not very clear, it's not very transparent. The supporters don't really know what's going on, and I can imagine a lot of people at the club and the players don't really know what's going on as well. And then they appointed Malky Mackay as the sporting director after he was sacked as manager of Ross County, which is problematic for all sorts of reasons before you get on to sporting terms. And it's just, I think that there needs to be processes in place that actually tell fan groups and supporters and members of the staff at clubs how these models are going to look before we go any further in terms of multi-club ownership.
Absolutely. And, you mentioned Bill Foley there. There's another Belgian connection here with Bill Foley, which brings all of this full circle, because Bill Foley was one of the first individuals to express an interest in acquiring Oostende when it became clear that trouble was on the horizon and that new ownership was going to have to happen for the clubs to survive. He had a look, and effectively it was the debt that put him off, because although Oostende in theory were available for a very modest amount of money, I mean, we're talking less than sort of 15 million euros, you could have bought Oostende. In order to do that, you had to buy them for a figure round about that, which is nothing. I mean, certainly to the individuals buying multi-club ownership models, I mean, that's a very modest fee to buy a football club. But on top of that, you would have to put in a reasonably major capital injection straight away, because in buying it at that level, all you're doing is buying the club, but then servicing the remaining debt in order to make it solvent. So you're balancing the books, but then you would have to throw, I don't know, as much as you wanted to throw at it in order to effectively start building things again. So that kind of 10 million debt that's been sitting there for Oostende, that's been left there, and it was a lot more than that. It was reduced quite considerably. That still is a problem. And from a financial point of view, anybody looking at that is going to go, why would I spend, like I was saying, a small amount of money, 12 to 15 million pounds to buy that club, to then need to throw at least that, if not twice that, at the beginning to start it again, when I could go and buy a club in a better financial situation. So there does become a tipping point here where even if you're interested in acquiring a club, that it doesn't make any sense financially for you either. And there's a point of, no return when a club is ruined financially to such an extent that nobody's going to be interested. And that's a deliberate tactic as well, of course. The reason it's so popular in Belgium is because it's so easy, because of the lack of regulation as well. You have that. And the other attractive thing for wealthy individuals is the fact that regulations for bringing in players from certain continents is as lax, and it's very easy. So City Football Group have benefited from bringing in players from South America, for example, who spend a year, 18 months developing at Lommel in Belgium before maybe going to Spain, to Girona. They might, if they're very, very lucky, end up at Manchester City. Very few do, but they will go to a bigger club in their food chain. So it's because of a lack of regulation and the fact that it's a brilliant environment for players to develop. They will get game time, which means they accrue value. And if they accrue value, they can be useful to you elsewhere in your network. So it does make business sense if you do it properly. And it comes back to what I was saying about the talent thing a little while ago. The owners of these networks have to have sporting directors in place, because that's a key strategic role at any club. Whether you're part of a multi-club ownership or not, the strategy has to be right for the club and it has to work. these individuals have to know what they're doing. And if they don't, Gotegan as an example, he doesn't know what he's doing and has proven that, there's a track record of failure there. Nobody should be looking at that individual for a role like that again. He's left Molenbeek now, as I was saying earlier as well. Which club he's going to end up next, we don't know. He might take some time out, but he has enough contacts to know that he will probably land in a similar role somewhere else. Alarm bells should be ringing for the fans of that club immediately. Follow the evidence here and you will just see it. But there are loopholes here for individuals whose intentions are questionable. That's part of the problem. And if we can close a lot of them, either wholly or in part, you protect that ecosystem. And I know a lot of people in Belgium now are in favour of no form of multi-club ownership. They would rather the club stayed in local hands. And a good example of this is KV Mechelen, who I've got a huge soft spot for lots of reasons. They turned down the opportunity of not new ownership, but fairly major investment about 2.5-3 years ago. They were offered 10 to 15 million pounds by a consortium of English businessmen who were looking to invest in a club. And the board at Mechelen turned that down because of their concerns around multi-club ownership and what that would mean for them. The issue that they've had is they're kind of falling behind. So they're finding it difficult now to remain as competitive as they would like to in the top division, the Pro League, because other clubs are seeing minority stakes coming in, which brings some money in, or they become part of a bigger food chain, a bigger network that is bringing increasing resources their way. So clubs like that, that's the dilemma for clubs. You would ideally stay like that, but the price of not investing, either yourself or through bringing in external people again, is that you find yourself in relegation battles that you don't want to be in. So there's a really difficult balancing act here to be judged, and you have to get that right, because if you don't, as a club, you can end up in the wilderness for a long time. That's happened to a lot of, pretty big English clubs because they've made bad choices and decisions. And Belgian football is much closer to the people, I think, than it is in a lot of bigger countries in Europe. That's one of the really great things about it. It's easier to access. Ticket prices are cheaper. Generally, season tickets are cheaper. It's much closer to fan bases. And that's a good thing. So if multi-club ownership models come in, they have to work. And all of the checks and balances that are inherent in that process have to, in Belgium and elsewhere, be tightened up so that what's happened to Oostende can't happen again, because there's a number of other clubs in Belgium, some in the top flight at the moment, who this could happen to, and quite soon, and clubs even further down the food chain below the Challenger Pro League who are in big trouble, who are right on the edge of this as well. So as I was saying, that the real danger is we're going to see more of this in a short period before it gets better. But these big questions can't be avoided anymore, and now is the perfect opportunity for some change.
Well, it's a big day for KVO for all the wrong reasons, of course, as you said at the beginning of the show. Today is the end, but it could be a big week in Belgian football for all the right reasons if they vote a certain way later on in the week. And obviously, this is a developing story, of course, so we'll maybe do more, and we'll maybe be able to do a follow-up should KVO come back. And as an outsider looking in, you'd imagine that they will, because they're a big club, they're a historic club, and you'd imagine that things will be done to bring them back in some capacity. Whether that's an emerger or otherwise, we don't know. But just from what you've seen so far and the information that we have in front of us at the moment, Scott, what do you think is next for KVO and the fans?
Well, as I was saying at the beginning, there's a history of football in that city, that goes beyond 100 years. So as of now, there is no professional football club in that city as of today, legally. And looking at those scenes yesterday and listening to some of those fans kind of talk, I would be very surprised if something didn't happen in the future. I think the dust has to settle a little bit. I think emotions are still extremely raw and will be for a long time. That won't change, I don't think. This won't be forgotten, particularly amongst the fan base, and rightly so. I think a lot of people now have to get together and decide what they want to do. I mean, one of the hurdles to what happens next was a couple of weeks ago when it was confirmed that the takeover had collapsed and that the bankruptcy was inevitable and would be filed today, was that the chief executives of 5 amateur clubs in the region came together and said that they felt a merger was unlikely because they didn't see a common interest in that. Now, obviously, Bart Tomaline, who you mentioned at the beginning, who's the mayor of Oostende, he's obviously had some conversations behind closed doors with some of these individuals for there to be a tiny change in the last 2 weeks, where he's thrown it out there publicly now that potentially maybe something could happen between KVO and Blankenberg. And if he said that publicly, then obviously there's been a degree of movement somewhere, even if it's just a bit of pressure on that. I think the fan base will have a massive, massive input into what happens here. I think if this is what they want and they support this move, then there's a strong likelihood that this will happen, because from a legal perspective, the club, although it's dead, it can come together from a clean slate point of view and start again several divisions down. Obviously, it's what happened with Lokeren, as I was saying. They merged instantly with Temps and came back immediately and have worked their way back up the divisions and have come back to a good level now. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with them this coming season, how close they can get to pushing to get back to the top flight, because they're a famous name as well. They've won titles. Most people know of Lokeren. They have a history of producing talent that's gone on to the top clubs in Belgium as well. The most famous one's probably Hans van Aken, big player in Belgium, huge legend at Club Brugge. So there's a number of things to kind of watch out for here. But yeah, I think the fan base's next move, I think, is going to be key in what happens here, because if there's a feeling that they want that to happen, then things could happen, because the financial aspect of that is marginally less important now. It's just the will to manage a merger, and the technicalities of that, as you were saying at the beginning, are very sensitive as well. Does that become Oostende Blankenberg, like Lokeren Temps? Does it stay KVO and Blankenberg are effectively absorbed? Yeah, there's so many questions there that need to be sorted out. But if those two fan groups can kind of come together, and it happens a lot in Belgium, I was saying, this is not an unusual practice, so it's not unusual. I think the dust has to settle a little bit first and see where we go from there. But the fact that the youth wing of the club is going to still exist in some form is encouraging as well. And seeing how committed those fans were yesterday, 1,500 turning up at quite short notice to spend some time at the ground and to get together and show some much needed solidarity, tells me that there's a groundswell there that something could happen. And there's a lot of goodwill to this club from other clubs in Belgium who are in trouble as well. So they totally get this. So yeah, once the dust is settled, perhaps, and I hope for that, and I would like to see that as well, just because this is a city that does have a long history of football, even if it's not one that, is historically significant. It's too big a geographical location in Belgium not to have a connection with football anymore. And if that means a merger has to happen for that presence to be maintained, then I think that's a positive thing.
No, for sure. And we both said at the start of recording, we don't want to be doing an episode on clubs that have just went defunct. I think the youth wing of the club still being around is a lifeline. I think you're right in saying that it's a positive and something to hold on to. And the fans coming out and en masse yesterday just to say goodbye, and I saw the photos of it. It was very, very emotional. We've seen it with KSK Beveren as well when we'd done that episode, and they were able to get the matricule number back, 2300, I think that was, which is obviously very important to a lot of clubs and their identities within Belgium. So, as I said, it's a developing story, so more will come out soon, and we'll be able to obviously keep you posted with what's going on with that. And of course, if you follow the Belgian Football Podcast in Scott, then they'll be able to keep you up to date with the things that are going on as well. Just before we finish up, Scott, is there anything else that you'd like to add before we go?
I think it's just, we've talked about this a lot. It's really frustrating and enraging, actually, that we've reached a point where, and I actually said this recently on an episode of the Belgian Football Podcast, that we never wanted to get together to discuss something like this. The inevitability of the history suggested it was going to happen again at some point. And a couple of weeks ago, we talked at length when this was confirmed that this was going to be happening. I think it's important. I would urge fans listening to this, regardless of who your club is, to go away and do some digging and do some research. I've been talking a lot about that. It's not difficult to do it. And, you will discover a lot through that. So although this is something that's come out of the blue for a lot of people, and when it was confirmed, there was a lot of people who got in touch with me looking for a little bit more information about this, because, you know, it was a bolt from the blue for them. But, you know, if you follow little details and certain individuals who have a part in this story, you'll see that this is just part of a much bigger ongoing story. The positive is that more and more fans in listening to this will know some of the names and organisations that now, yeah, I think you would want to avoid if they ever crop up in footballing conversations.
Definitely, and I can second that sentiment as well. Go and do your research on the owners of your football club, because you'll probably be surprised, and not for the right reasons. There's a lot going on within club ownership at the moment, so I think doing that research and having some fan powers in place to check that is definitely something that needs to happen. However, I think we're a while away from that happening, unfortunately, but we can only see how things unravel over the next few years, I suppose. Scott, thank you very much for coming on to talk about KV Oostende with us. It's been a really fascinating episode, a really good insight into how things in Belgian football work and how things have transpired with KV Oostende and all the different links and trails that you followed, as you said. Thank you once again to all of our listeners who tuned in for this episode. If there's a topic that you want us to cover which revolves around football history, heritage, identity, culture, community, place, you name it, then get in touch and we'll do our best to get you on the show so that we can cover it. Always happy to have a chat with people if it's about football and football history and heritage, so you can reach us on @_footyheritage on X, or hello@footballheritage.co.uk if you'd rather email us. Please do feel free to get in touch. We're more than happy to speak with you about the topic that you have in mind. But for now, Scott, say goodbye.
Thanks for having me, Rory. It's been great.
And it's a goodbye from me as well. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.